So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the OBBB, or One Big Beautiful Bill, is now law in the United States. It eliminates the 30% tax credit for residential solar and adds restrictions to the 30% tax credit for commercial solar. And just to note, commercial solar includes residential leases and PPAs, which are all done under a commercial business structure. But effectively, the price for cash and loan purchases of solar goes up 30% in 2026. Solar leasing and PPAs, since they're still commercial, is more complicated, but it's getting more complicated, which means that the pricing is going to go up. There's also domestic content rules, safe harbor considerations, and foreign entity of concern issues that are going to complicate product availability and pricing through the end of 2025 and going forward into 2026 and 2027. So it's been a challenge for a lot of businesses. And just recently, there's a typical solar business crash landing story. It happens to be about Posigen, but it's happened at many other installation and finance companies. And here's how it went. I'll just go through this kind of quickly. The installer said it grew its operations rapidly, which later led to a liquidity strain. Amid market slowdown, it was forced to use its working capital to advance contracted solar projects to completion, which pressured liquidity. The company then made a missed interest payment on its credit facility in favor of preserving capital to pay its channel partners and pay operating expenses. Its lenders then exercised its rights to freeze cash and issue a notice of default on Posigen's credit facility. This caused a sudden and unexpected interruption in the company's business operations, said the termination letter. And the company is now determined that it is unable to secure sufficient capital to continue most of its operations and avoid the need for significant headcount reduction, said the letter. It's terrible when that happens. It kind of creeps up on you, but if you've kind of over-leveraged yourself, there's often no way out. And it's happening now. I mean, I see businesses all over the solar industry expanding quickly. Every contractor is working like crazy to get systems installed by the end of 2025. And 2025, I think, is going to be a record year for solar and battery installations. So smart companies now are planning for 2026. And it raises two questions. One, what should solar contractors do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And what should solar and battery customers consider when evaluating products and installers? Now, this week's guest is Dan Javan, former CEO of Centuity. Dan built Centuity into one of the largest rooftop solar installers in the U.S. with operations in 25 states. He's the smartest guy I know about solar financing. And since financing has been key to over 75% of residential systems, it's really helpful to hear Dan's insights into solar loans and TPO financing now in 2026 and beyond. And especially with the impact of even more recent things like the August 15th executive order modifying the OBBB. And nobody has a perfect crystal ball, but there may be other orders coming from the White House or other decisions that are going to make solar financing tricky. So with that intro, welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Barry. Really excited to be here.
All right. I've been waiting for this show, been waiting to kind of get you on. This is going to be really, really good. So just some background questions that's going to help non-experts understand some of these things. What's the rough breakdown for residential solar among cash purchases, solar loans, and third-party ownership structures like leases and PPAs?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. So cash purchases are probably around 5% of the industry today. Loans are about 40 to 45%, and the balance 50 to 55% is the TPO mix. With the 25D expiration at the end of this year, we're going to see probably about a third of the loan and cash mix switch to TPO. But overall, we expect about a 30 to 35% reduction in the industry next year once the loans go away.
All right. So why is TPO financing going to increase in popularity as a result of the OBBB?
Well, unfortunately, with the change in the tax credits on the residential systems, the only other financing that you have available that actually can leverage it is the TPO financing. Again, loans can no longer leverage the 30% after this year. So you're going to see that shift towards TPO only to be able to leverage the 30% tax credit. But again, that 30% tax credit comes with a whole bunch of restrictions, price increases, cost increases, which I think we'll get into this podcast, but that's really what's causing the shift. I think it's a temporary shift, and I think you're going to see a shift away from TPOs in 2026 towards the end into 2027, when you'll see the competition coming in from opportunities that don't need the 30% tax credit. And we'll get in details in this podcast later on.
Right, that's good. So I'm not a finance expert anymore, so my head really starts spinning with terms and conditions. So just a bunch of questions. What is commence construction for residential size systems?
Yeah, so commence construction is when, under the safe harbor guidance, at least now it's documented, you need to spend at least 5% of the cost on either materials or actual construction cost. That does not include items that are off the shelf, right? So the guidance under the OBB is you can't just spend 5% on inventory. It's got to be specific for projects, and that's considered, begun construction. Now, one of the other clarifying points that the OBB put together for commercial and utility scale projects is there's no longer a fixed number. It now requires, it's subject to interpretation, or begun construction subject to interpretation of the Treasury, which actually is at risk for commercial and utility scale projects that we can also get into further in the podcast. But by definition, that's really what it is right now.
So, and those rules at the Treasury can change if somebody wants to change them. When does commence construction expire, and what are the implications?
So under the OBB or the OBBB, July of next year is when you have to commence construction to qualify for 4 years of safe harbor. So if you start construction by July of next year, you'll have 4 years to complete the projects, which is really what, we're hearing more and more in the market about. Financiers like Sunrun and some of the other financiers are looking at safe harboring, where they're looking at acquiring product that's not off the shelf, that lets them now commence and complete multiple projects over 4 years. And we can get into nuances around that as well, because buying technology and leveraging for 4 years is not a very cost-effective way and a more efficient way of actually deploying solar. For example, Enphase just announced $50 million in transaction cost on safe harbor with their IQ8HC microinverters, for example. Most people don't realize the IQ8C cuts off at 384 watts. You already had a 455 watt product. If you try using that microinverter for the next 4 years, you'll be in a wattage class of 550, 555 watt in about 3 years. And you're capping your AC output at 384 watts. So while it might sound like you can get the 30% ITC, it's actually detrimental to the project performance data and the numbers that at that point, I think far exceeds the 30% gain on the ITC. So it's not a good business decision after probably 2 years. So when people talk about a 4-year runway on safe harbor with 2 years of actual good business decision making, you've got to take those kind of things with a grain of salt. But most business owners and investors haven't got into that level of detail just yet, but that's something to consider, on the safe harbor side.
That is kind of the exact issue that makes me so concerned about long-term safe harboring, because I see the product life cycle in this industry. Certain microinverters, 2 or 3 years, battery systems, 3 years at most. And I don't want to be stuck selling a circa 2025 battery system in 2027. I'm going to be selling a new system. I'm going to clobber anybody that's competing against me with old technology. So it changes. But one question backing up, that 5% for the commence construction, does that include the sales and the design costs?
No, so it's no longer going to be untangible. It's got to be tangible. So it's actually got to be product or actual construction costs on site. Even on the commercial side, like if you did design and even if you did civil work, it would not be considered part of the cost towards the safe harbor. So it's got to be actual tangible costs. So if it's not actual product, you've actually got to start construction on site. And we all know residential typically is a 6-hour or 8-hour construction cycle, which means if you already started construction on site, you're probably finishing it that day, right? So unless you spend the money, it's going to be tough for you to substantiate it otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. We talked about safe harboring. What kind of equipment can be safe harbored?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different things. You could safe harbor panels, you can safe harbor inverters. I mean, in residential, it's usually stuck between these two because you need to spend at least 5% of the cost, but you also need to make sure that you're investing in something that actually lets you deliver across a gamut, which is why inverters typically are the safe harbor product of choice because it gives you flexibility with different modules. If you safe harbor a module, which again, a lot of that used to happen back in 2011, 2012, where people would safe harbor modules. Now you're keeping that for 4 years in inventory in a warehouse. It takes up more space, it costs more money, and frankly, modules actually age faster from a generational perspective than inverters do. So inverters are the natural progression for safe harbor, but even inverters, like we just discussed, they've got a shelf life, they've got a generational, life attached to it. So the practical application of safe harboring inverters is maybe 2 years and not the full 4.
And I accentuate that by early 2026, maybe even towards the end of this year, we will no longer be selling inverters. We are going to be selling complete systems with batteries in them because our battery attachment rate's like over 95%. So you can't just safe harbor, $1,000 inverter or a bunch of microinverters. You've got to safe harbor an entire battery system because it's all in one box.
That's right.
It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I think I'm a little bit more skeptical on how that's going to work for battery systems. But then again, batteries, my understanding, we'll talk about this in a sec, they're still available for the tax credit under the commercial rules.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. So we talked about that. And what are some of the costs of safe harboring? I mean, I hear stories about companies safe harboring literally acres of stacked solar panels. How does
Yeah.
that affect economics?
Yeah, so, I've been through 3 cycles of this already. I've been in this business since 2008, so I'm dating myself out here. And we've had these situations happen. The investment tax credit was a grant back in 2010, 2011, and there was a lot of safe harboring happening at that time. And we saw that, the investment is one part of it, but the carrying cost of the actual safe harbor product sometimes is as much from a cost perspective as the actual value of the safe harbor itself, right? And I remember like NRG back in the days had safe harbor product. They had actually safe harbored sun power modules at $1.10 a watt, and the market had dropped down to 40 cents a watt, and they liquidated those modules after 8 years of holding them in inventory for 15 cents a watt, right? So when you look at all these different nuances, safe harbor sounds like it's a good option, but you're going to spend more because there's only certain products that you could safe harbor that actually will cross that 5% threshold. But again, you're paying a premium for that product. There's going to be a generational gap by the time you use it in year 2. So you're going to lose money on that. You're actually going to inventory that product and hold that on your books. There's a cost of capital attached to it. And then mistakes happen when you deploy safe harbor, because in safe harbor situations, you've got to match serial numbers to a project. And by mistake, if you install the wrong product, because you have safe harbor and non-safe harbor in the same warehouse, you lost the whole ITC on that project, which now means there's a recapture on the TPO. And I can guarantee you, expect 4 to 8% of projects when you have safe harbor and non-safe harbor to actually get into that situation. I mean, it's happened to us. So you're losing money, you just think you're not.
Yeah.
So it's not a good concept.
I can't conceive of how you would make sure that a particular module serial number that's in a Raiders of the Lost Ark style warehouse that just goes on and on and on, which I've been in some of those, how you can get that particular module onto a particular customer's roof. It's almost an impossible tracking. Maybe put an air tag on every module. I don't know. Okay, let's talk about what is the 10% domestic content adder?
So the 10% domestic content adder for this year, so 45% of the content in your stack, on your hardware stack, if it's made in the USA and qualifies for domestic content, you get an additional 10% bonus on the ITC. And for next year, it's 50%. And then for a year after that, it goes up to 55%. The challenge is domestic content product costs more money, right? The target is changing, so 45 to 50 to 55%. And most people don't realize that extra 10% boost is going to the TPO provider, right? And even the TPO provider doesn't actually benefit from the 10%. The tax equity costs money, the cost of capital costs money, and then the EPC, by the time that 10% trickles down, the EPC is probably getting 4% out of that 10%. But to get that additional 4%, and if you look at average project cost of there was just an article I saw just the other day from NRGCH, $2.48 is the average cost. So 4% of $2.48 is about 9-cent bonus, right? But you're going to spend another 20 to 25 cents to get domestic content product, right? So you're spending 20 to 25 cents more in hardware to gain 9 cents. I mean, that's a lose-lose situation. But that's really what the domestic content is all about. And more TPO providers are requiring that. And they're not necessarily rewarding you with that extra 10%. You might see a 3 to 4% bump. So to get that 4% bump, you end up spending another 15 or 10 to 15%, depending on how the cash flows work. You lose money. But that's anyways the domestic content adder.
Okay, and then the last question, the last terminology, what are foreign entities of concern and what impact does that have on the solar business?
So that is actually a big concern that people haven't even started looking at, right? So under the new administration, some of the guidelines are there's only certain percentage of, and it's not just ownership, it's not just content, it's even influence, right? That can actually originate from certain countries like China, North Korea, Iran. So if you've got product, or if you've got cash, or if you've got even influence coming into an entity from an FEOC restricted country, you no longer qualify for the ITC. And that entire value chain is subject to interpretation by the Treasury Department. So if the Treasury Department comes back and says, this XYZ company product that's been used in the project is influenced by Chinese influence, which means there might be some equity, there might be some decision-making, there might be someone on the board of Chinese origin, and you no longer qualify for ITC. Can you imagine after you already sold a project with the expectation to get ITC and it is denied in an audit? I mean, that's a disaster waiting to happen. And that is going to go into effect starting next year in Jan. And there's no fixed guidelines around it just yet. There's just a percentage saying the percentage cannot exceed, 45 or 50%. But the one of the caveats that's not on a percentage basis from a dollars and cents perspective, it's influence. So if the Treasury says, no, we see there's influence from one of these countries, you no longer qualify for ITC, the whole tranche that uses that product disqualifies. And that's a disaster waiting to happen, which is why you have investors today that are extremely spooked on the investment tax credit for residential. And that is why, and we'll get into it, on what the challenges are that TPO finance companies are facing today when it comes to investors, when it comes to cost of capital, when it comes to, bringing in debt on the mezzanine and the debt stack, that is going to now trickle down to EPCs in the field. And like most EPCs are not even privy to this kind of stuff. And you could have another situation just like you did with, Posigen, where someone else now basically goes belly up because these are things they couldn't control and it happens overnight and you have no control or say on it. And you're just a recipient of the bad news, right? So that's where I think a lot of 2026 is also going to move into, which we should be concerned about.
Yeah. Well, that just brings in the uncertainty issue in so much more focus. All right. So great job on the terminology and conditions. And I think it's just good to explain these sometimes again and again to people. So now let's kind of dive in specifically to loan and TPO financing. We can talk about it individually, but what's going to happen between now and the end of 2025? Because it's basically mostly baked. And then 2026, 2027 and beyond. So fill me in on what you think about those two big categories.
Yeah, so I think, we look at loans and TPOs as two separate categories. So a lot of loan providers are now stopping offering loans that actually take the ITC into account. Some of them are stopping providing loans by, say, the 15th of September, some of them by, say, October. And a lot of that has to do with the guidance that under 25D, to get ITC, the system has to be, in service, right, by the end of the year. And again, this is debated by certain folks where some folks say, no, you only have to spend the money. But really the guidance I look at is pretty clear, where the system needs to be in a position that it can actually supply electrons to the grid, which means you need to have finished inspections, it needs to be substantially complete, and you should have already filed for PTO and to be safe, actually acquired PTO, right? So loan providers are already stopping offering loans that actually now leverage ITC. You're going to see a stream of loans coming out starting October 15th onwards that are non-ITC centric, which means you're going to see more and more loan providers haircutting the dealer fees on loans, because without ITC, there's no way to substantiate a 30% dealer fee, right? They just can't even afford it. So you're going to see interest rates rising on loans. You're going to see dealer fees coming down because it's a higher interest rate. And I think you're going to see that change and transition happening over the next 2 months, which means you can still get a loan for a solar system. It just won't be lucrative like it was before, where you have a 32% or 34% dealer fee with a 2.99% APR because of the buy down. Now, on the TPO side, you're seeing a ramp up happening on the TPO. But the challenge that most TPO providers are facing right now is what I was alluded to before, which is there's a shortage of tax equity because investors see residential and even renewables in general, the risk profile has increased radically. You're seeing delinquencies going up on payments, which means debt financing is also getting more expensive. We're seeing generally credit scores going down across the board because we're seeing more and more people are not paying their bills on time, and we're seeing delinquencies increasing on renewables compared to when interest rates were lower and people actually were spending money a little bit more freely. There's liquidity issues in the market for renewables. And then the biggest thing that actually affects installers is the mezzanine debt, which is the bridge loan that TPO providers take between a system getting installed to a system going in service. Because most TPO providers will pay 70 or 80% of the TPO EPC cost to a contractor at install completion, but then it could be 60 days before that system goes live. And they're carrying that on their balance sheet. And a lot of folks, that cash is the most expensive cash that you can raise. It's the cash that's at highest risk. And that cash has a tremendous amount of shortage, which is why even if you want to sell more, right, you won't be able to afford to sell more because there's only so much cash that a TPO provider has free flowing for that 60-day or 90-day gap between install and in service to be able to service that project. And without that, EPCs can survive. So you're going to see all these nuances come into play on the TPO side in 2026 that I think will actually be a detriment to going towards a TPO product.
Interesting. All right. Well, there's certainly opportunities for installers to get money to keep their business going, but it's challenging. But what about the customers? How should homeowners be concerned about the integrity of their system, the maintenance on their system, if they're working through a loan or a TPO company that may have problems in the future?
Yeah. So the way I would position this, no company today is too big to fail, right? And we've seen that with some of the biggest names in the industry. So as an EPC or as a consumer, you want to make sure that any project that is going into service includes some kind of third-party insurance that actually is backstopped by a legitimate insurance company. And there's a couple of different insurance providers out there for solar that, that really rely on the EPCs for the first 10 years, and then they expect to service it after that. You need to stay away from that. And there are insurance providers today that'll give you day one coverage that's insured by like a Lloyd's of London, for example, right? So as a consumer or as an EPC, you want to make sure you bake that into every single project without fail, because you never know what happens, regardless of whether it's a TPO provider or if it's a loan or if it's a cash deal, because what most contractors don't realize, when financiers go out of business, the liability shifts to them, right? A homeowner, even though they might have signed an agreement with a lease provider, if their system is not performing and the lease provider has gone out of business, and we've seen that happen over the last couple of years with different finance companies, they're going to go after the EPC. And regardless of whether you have a contract with the homeowner or not, state AGs are more and more looking at the EPC as a responsible party when something like that happens, because again, they don't want 100,000 customers that have no coverage. So they're going to go after the EPCs. EPCs are going to have to make sure the insurances cover that. Insurances have deductibles. So having third-party insurance out of the gate gives you peace of mind that in case something happens, you've done the right thing to your customer, which at the end of the day, and we'll get into what are the changes that EPCs can do to their business to actually weather the storm, is I think fundamental taking care of your customer first should be fundamental, regardless of who the financier is, because that is how you actually can grow and survive the storm.
But how can a customer really tell? I mean, and I go through these documents, it never lists who the insurance company is. How can the customer tell if it's Lloyd's of London or Mike's Pawn Shop that's backing the system up?
And that's exactly why when an EPC is actually providing the insurance to a customer, they should actually highlight these things. These are things that customers should ask. These are the things that the EPC should ask insurance providers. Show me how you're backstopping this, insurance. If you go out of business, what happens? Show me the language in the literature that says this is where it's covered, this is when it's covered, and this is by whom it's covered, right? If you can answer what, why, and how, that to me is the way to go. And that should just be part of every project that EPC should deliver.
Okay. All right, we might talk about financing a little bit more, but let's talk about some of the other main considerations that solar installers should have to make sure they're going to succeed in 2026 and beyond. Just kind of the general business things that may not be apparent to many medium and large and even small solar installers.
Yeah, so I think a lot of installers, and especially the small to mid-size installers, don't actually realize the true cost of delivering a system, right? If you ask folks, well, what is your cost of acquisition? A lot of folks think they know what the cost of acquisition is, but they don't actually truly know it until they actually deconstruct marketing costs, sales costs, cancellation rate, all those different things. And like your cost of acquisition is just one portion of it. Same thing on the cost of delivery, right? A lot of folks don't realize how many truck rolls they've made to finish a job, right? From the time they actually commence the site survey, most people don't realize they could be 3, 4, 5 truck rolls before that job actually goes live. So first thing that they need to do is deconstruct their total cost stack and be honest about it. A lot of folks come back and say, oh no, my cost to install is 25 cents a watt. Till they actually look at the numbers. And then they come back and say, holy cow, I didn't realize we went back to this homeowner 4 times. My cost to install might have been 25 cents, but my truck rolls after that cost me another 30 cents, right? And then there might be damage on the house and you're paying for these things. So deconstructing your costs is your first step. The next step, obviously, is sound business practices. You need to come up with budgets for the different pieces of the puzzle that takes to deliver your project. And you need to hold yourself to that budget. And if you're not holding yourself to that budget, you're losing money. You just don't realize it till it actually catches up with you. And a lot of these things are exercises that people need to go through. The challenge right now is, Barry, everyone is so busy delivering projects. They're not seeing if they're making money, losing money, or if they will actually monetize this in the right way because they're just so busy, which is why someone within an organization, or you bring in external, fractional CSO or fractional CFO that actually is looking at where you're digging the trench to make sure you're not digging it off a cliff, right? And those are some of the things that I think, you and I had this session just before this, where like, if you can have working sessions with EPCs where they know where to look, what stone to uncover, they'll realize pretty quickly they're losing money and bleeding money, and they didn't realize it all this time,
Well,
right? The first step. And then also understanding budgets from peers. Like, what do other companies spend to do an install or to do the marketing or to do the cost of acquisition? And then look at best in class prices. And then learn from that and start holding some of those things internally as a level of accountability to actually make money. Because if you're not profitable, you're just losing more money and you're doing it in volume.
Well, yeah, Dan, I'm going to give you the perspective of a typical solar installer, and I'm not going to name names, but we've had so much demand. We've never booked so many jobs over the last 3 months than we have recently, and we're just going crazy with our crews. We just hired 4 more crews to get all this work done. So I must be making more money because I'm going to generate record revenues this year. So what do I need that for? And you hit the nail on the head when you start deconstructing these things and you look at the overtime you're paying and look at all the extra costs, and then you're going to have to maybe downsize next year. That's typical thing that's going to hit installers next year when they realize, gee, I didn't make as much money as I thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll quote Paul Stefan out here, right? So sales is vanity, EBITDA is reality, and cash is king, right? So most people are looking at sales and they're like, well, we sold out of we hit it out of the park. We've got, 300 sales. Sales are through the roof. well, what's your attrition rate? What's your pull-through rate, right? And then even on the pull-through rate, like, are you actually making money on that? And then if you're even making money, are you doing it in a fiscally responsible manner that actually gives you the cash flow to sustain your business? Because most people don't realize companies go out of business not just when they're not doing well. They also go out of business when they're doing extremely well but can't handle and manage the cash flow. And in fact, it is easier to go out of business when you're doing extremely well and you don't have your eye on the cash flow. That's really where things happen pretty quickly, and they're pretty dramatic when that happens. So that's something that most installers need to keep their eyes open for.
So, what are some specifics for installers to do right now? Should they go out and hire a consultant to help them with these things and really kind of figure out? Because obviously, most installers, they don't have time right now to dig into it. But this is the time when they've got to start planning and making sure that they're executing right, especially going into 2026.
Yes, so unfortunately, Barry, there's not a lot of consultants out there that are also entrepreneurs that have built businesses to scale, right? It requires folks that have built businesses to scale that actually you can learn from, that have done it the right way. And that's why I recommended like working sessions with some of the EPCs out there. And the advantage to that is, deconstructing is not that difficult if you know what to look for. Yes, there's some time, money, and effort that goes on the accounting side when that happens, but that is something that most contractors should do regardless. And then most contractors don't realize what is considered good industry practice and industry standard. And that is where good working sessions come from, right? Like, I have a lot of contractors that come to me that I give them advice on these kind of things. And, I'll take a look at their books and I'll tell them, like, within 15 minutes of looking at their books, where they're exceeding certain thresholds on cost tax or whatever have you. The other thing most people don't realize, that there's a lot of wastage in soft costs being overheads, administrative costs, and I'll give you an example. In one of my companies, my monthly software licensing cost was about $180,000 a month.
Wow.
Right? But you could probably do 80% of that on a platform today like Subcontractor Hub without spending even a fraction of that, right? So why reinvent the wheel? Why deploy something like Salesforce that's cost you $300,000 to deploy? It's going to cost you $60,000, $70,000 a month in licenses, when you have a platform like Subcontractor Hub, for example, that you can leverage that does 80% of that. That is just money coming straight out of your bottom line, right? And things like that, like even engineering, permitting, interconnection. There are third-party companies that you can leverage that are tried and tested, that you can actually leverage, that will reduce your overhead, reduce your cost by almost 60, 70%. Why not leverage those companies instead of trying to do everything in-house, and then you're stuck with all the issues that go with it? You would rather keep one person in-house to coordinate and QA QC and externalize, reduce your team size from 8 to maybe 1 or 2. That is just pure savings in overhead. And it's things like that that most people don't think about that they should do, because right now they're just too busy doing work. They are not, like we just discussed, they don't know if they actually made money or lost money. But when the dust settles, they'll realize if the changes they made based on some of these recommendations were implemented, they would have actually either made money or made more money, which at the end of the day means healthy business practices and so on and so forth.
I'll tell you, just in my experience, it's a lot more fun. It's a lot easier to steadily or quickly expand a business. And it's really, really hard to downsize it, especially when you've got these stubborn soft costs, fixed costs like software licenses. You can't get out of that for a year or two. You have a huge overhead in the back office that you can't adjust. You've got fleets and fleets of trucks that you just can't instantly liquidate, but you're paying insurance and loans on those. So kind of downsizing is tricky. I don't want to jump ahead, and I don't want to say that this is what everybody's going to happen, but what are some of the suggestions you have for companies adjusting to the new 2026 and beyond reality of slower sales?
Yeah, so, I think the first thing that needs to happen is people need to run sound businesses with sound business practices, which means run a healthy business with a focus on customer service, because that is really what's bringing your cost of acquisition down. Most people are looking for that initial sale, right? The smart people are looking for the third and the fourth sale from that initial sale, because your cost of acquisition goes down with every referral that comes in. But your referrals are purely dependent on the way you treat your customers, right? So if you run sound businesses with sound business practices, with customer focus first and foremost, with a low cost of acquisition, you're actually going to not just weather the storm, you'll be able to actually grow your business while others shrink. There's a consolidation that's happening in the market. In fact, I've had EPCs reach out to me asking me if I'd be interested in setting up a new company to consolidate different EPCs in the market. But you don't have to go to that extreme. Having open dialogue with other EPCs, networking with other EPCs, understanding what someone is paying for product that you're paying for, right? I mean, there's a huge difference in cost of product between EPCs. There are EPCs that are buying panels today for 45 cents a watt. There are EPCs that are buying the same panel today for 28 cents a watt, right? There are people that are buying microinverters for 38, 40 cents a watt, and there are other EPCs that are buying the same microinverter, for 28 cents a watt. Or there might be an opportunity to switch from a microinverter type solution to something like a Tesla string inverter that'll cost you 50% less than a microinverter, right? And gives you even more flexibility. Actually building projects for scalability, and we'll get into that a little bit, but like storage, right? Either you deploy storage or you make a home storage ready, because then you go and upsell storage a year or two from now, and you don't have to then go and reinstall anything. Then you just basically go and plug in a battery. Decisions like that you make today are actual decisions that will pay dividends. And again, this is where working sessions come in, but having those kind of ideas and deployment practices is really where I think EPCs need to go to help develop their business. And then obviously, we talk about diversification, but even before you diversify a business into roofing and HVAC, I would suggest people go deep, don't go broad, right? People are looking at still expanding into different states, right? This is not the time to expand into different states. This is the time to hunker down. This is the time to grow deep roots in the state that you're in. I'd rather be a big fish in a small pond than a small fish in a big pond, because then you have liabilities that come with it, right? And again, the time to expand is once you establish a business model that actually doesn't rely on the investment tax credit, doesn't rely on TPO financing. That is really when you start talking about expansion. And frankly, that's something I think you should look at second half of 2026 into 2027, because I think you're going to see TPOs have a shelf life. And most people haven't quite, realized that just yet. But for all the reasons we just talked about, I think EPCs will outcompete TPOs on cash deals because of the restrictions that TPOs will bring in. So don't rely on TPOs, don't rely on financing, build a sound business that doesn't rely on subsidies. And then if you get subsidies, it's just, cream on top of the pudding, right? That's the way I would suggest people approach their businesses.
Dan, that's really great advice. I couldn't agree more about going deep. I couldn't agree more about being careful about expanding geographically. My experience at my old company, Akina's, the more territories we covered, the bigger we got, the more states we were in, the more money we lost. Our revenues were up, but it was just almost impossible to manage all those different locations. But, we're on a roll here. What other advice do you have? What other things should we talk about?
I think, we talk about a working session. I think that's important, but, I think people have to look at their equipment stack. I think there's a lot of savings out there, and I've seen savings of 20 or 25 cents a watt. And if you're looking at 250 a watt average selling price, 25 cents a watt is 10% addition to your EBITDA, right? Most EPCs today are between 9 to 12% if they know what they're doing. This takes you up to the 20 or 25% range. You should be looking at that. And then the other challenge that I've seen in the industry is you still have a lot of EPCs that are relying on dealer models, where they're having a red line model and they're paying sales engines and sales orgs, the balance above it, like those days are gone, right? You need to start running a business where you're actually doing marketing. And again, there's marketing companies that are specific to solar that can handle all of this for you. You don't need to do this all in-house. And there's a lot of different companies that people reach out to me on LinkedIn, I can introduce them to, where they'll take care of your entire marketing stack. They'll take care of all your SEO. They'll take care of all your Facebook ads, and they'll run ads that have already been tried and tested on Facebook. So you don't start from scratch. But going back to the traditional sales model, where you're actually interacting with homeowners, where you're actually mining your homeowners for referrals, by actually providing good customer service and exceeding expectations. Like these are just some of the fundamentals that most EPCs need to do. And then I would say stay away as much as possible from big finance. That'll come back and bite you later, right? If you asked all the folks that were with Posigen up until Monday last week, they would be like, this is the best thing that could ever happen to them because they didn't have to worry about credit, didn't have to worry about anything. Now, all of a sudden, they're scrambling to see if they can move their loans or their leases. And unfortunately, the terms and conditions of one financier may not work for another one, which means you're going to lose a customer, you're going to lose a sales org because they're just going to the next EPC that's going to give them more money or actually take the deals. You lose all the investment you made in the deal itself to get it to a point where it was ready to install. That's just pure loss. And then obviously anything you don't get paid from the financier just exacerbates the situation, right? So self-sufficient, self-reliance, good business practices, deconstruct to reconstruct, right? And then leverage the networks, leverage your podcast. I mean, there's a lot of good information on your podcast. Ask for working sessions, that we can do. These are some of the things I would actually look at for people to weather the storm that's coming.
All right, that's super great suggestions. So what's the good news going into 2026, 2027? What are the opportunities that are out there for well-run companies? How are they going to fare?
So, I truly believe in disaster-lies opportunity, right? I don't think disaster struck just yet, but what you do to plan for the disaster will differentiate what you end up with when the disaster occurs, right? There's an opportunity to consolidate. A lot of companies now actually, instead of expanding to states, will partner with different companies in states, which means if you've got originations that are occurring in New Jersey and you've got a referral coming in California, partner with companies in California that can deliver. Don't go and open up a California office, right? Running a sound business practice that's no longer dependent on subsidies and dependent on financier requirements allows you and puts you in the driver's seat to make business decisions that's in your best interest. Like today, if you actually went ahead with a TPO financing deal, there's only certain products that you can use. There's only certain, domestic content requirements that are kicking in. There's a certain requirement for getting paid. All those kind of things that come into play. Start building a business that is independent, because then you are truly a business that's not reliant on what the government does. And the other thing that, I tell people is start thinking forward. What happens in California, for example, happens in the rest of the US in about a year or two, right? What happens in Europe happens in California about in a year or two. So there's this natural movement of policies that we see that happen globally that actually come into California and then happen into other parts of the US. And I'm talking about net metering, for example, right? Don't rely on net metering. Net metering, as you know it, kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour, is going to go away eventually. Utilities are now more and more empowered to actually do things like that, which means start talking about, just like you as a business owner want independence, a homeowner should have independence. And you don't have true independence unless you've got storage attached to it, right? And a lot of folks try to solve the storage puzzle by an all or nothing situation, which is with batteries you install in your house, right? And I've said this on multiple forums, the largest battery in your house, it's not going to be on the wall, it's going to be on your garage, right? It's going to be your car. So if you look at, for example, Franklin, right? So with their A-gate transfer switch, I know it's limited to 80 amps max, but if you install a battery on the wall and now you plug in a Quasar 2 charger and actually you plug in your EV9, you can actually use a battery in your EV9 to back up your home, right? And then in the future, you can use a battery in the EV9, and I'm using that just as an example, or your car, to play the demand response revenue stream, to play the VPP revenue stream, right? So as a EPC, if you set up the customer for success, not just from monetization on kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour under the existing NEM rules, but in the future, kilowatt hour for kilowatt, kilowatt peak on the demand side or kilowatt hour in front of the meter on the VPP side, you now give the customer flexibility, but you also give them a revenue stream over the next 20 plus years, right? And I would actually, in fact, as an EPC, looking at investing forward on things like that, because the incremental cost, for example, to install, a transfer switch that's capable of doing these things, it might sound a lot more, but if you did that with the requirement that the customer come to you in the future on leveraging VPP or whatever have you, there's ways for the contractors to participate on the VPP side. There's ways for them to participate on things that the homeowner might want to do with EV chargers and so on and so forth. So start thinking along those lines on the long tail, not on the short gain, because the short gain is gone, right? I mean, it's long tail, and I think I said this in the beginning of the conversation. You need to know how to extract water from rock, and there's a lot of water in this rock, but we've been just too busy, just drinking our fill with rivers of water all around us. Now it's drying up, so we need to start getting a little bit smarter. So starting to do these things is really, I think, the industry is forcing us to do it. Legislation is forcing us to do it, which I think in one way is good because you're now truly becoming an industry, right? You're not relying on subsidies. You're not relying on certain types of financing. You're leveraging sound business practices. There's consolidation opportunities happening. So these are the things I think the people that are smart will grow leaps and bounds. And the people that are not will either get snuffed out or we'll have to move into something else out of solar because there's no money left otherwise.
You're describing the solar coaster as I've known it for almost 25 years. There's ups and downs, and the companies that are smart to figure out, how to change when it's going up and they have a chance, and then they're able to survive the downturn. So we are going into the biggest change I've seen in the last 25 years, but it's going to be the companies that are farsighted and taking the actions that you're suggesting to really be the ones who thrive. All right, we're getting towards the end here. What prompted you to get into this crazy solar coaster business?
Yeah, no. So, like I said earlier, right, I've dated myself. I've been in this business 17 years. It started with my own residential system. That time it was a SunPower system, and I paid, I remember, $7.10 a watt for it. And when I looked at it and the opportunity, obviously the opportunity was great, but I got into it not just, I didn't get into it from a monetization perspective, right? There's few things you can do in life where you can actually give back while you gain, and renewables is one of them. And the give back is not just to the community, but you empower homeowners when you give them control of their power generation. You actually can change people's lives. And again, it's also good for the environment, regardless of what some of the the new language that you're hearing coming out. Climate change is real, which is really what got me into it. So I'm truly, a believer in renewables, and I do believe in karma, and I think what you do comes back to you. So helping people eventually leads to people helping you, and helping the environment helps you indirectly. So that's what got me into this, and I'm passionate about it. And you can sense when I speak about it, there's a lot of that passion coming through, but I've seen multiple cycles, right? This cycle is different. This cycle, you've got 3.5 years of an administration that has made it basically their motto to actually completely derail renewables, right? And so you're going to see, and we're only 8 months into this administration, you have another 3.5 years left. So if you think this is the worst, there's a lot more to come, right? And the sooner you start gearing up to do the things that I just talked about, the better prepared you're going to be, because things are going to come in ad hoc, left and right, whether it's NEM 2.0 to 3.0, or it's ITC, or it's debt financing, or whatever have you, or retail rates on utility. The one good thing is rates on the utility side are going up like they've never gone up before, right? Which makes solar, even without the tax benefits, extremely not just competitive, you can outcompete utilities, which is why you're seeing utilities are coming back and saying, we'll no longer pay you retail, right? We'll pay you a fraction of the retail, which is why attachment of storage, enabling storage, things like that, gives you the ability to hedge against all the challenges that you will potentially face downstream. And then you monetize long tail. That's the way I would go about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bummer that we're looking at simple paybacks here in California, going from 6 or 7 years with just solar to now, maybe 10 years with solar and a battery, but 10 years is still a 10% ROI. And the electric rates are going to go up. And then finally, the last thing is we can always count on the sun coming up. So that's going to come up. That's going to be a source of energy. And as long as you've got a business that can be profitably able to take advantage of that, there's lots and lots of opportunity. Well, all right. We talked enough about solar. What do you do for fun?
So I've been a pilot 28 years, right? So I'm a commercial pilot and flight instructor. And when I'm not working on solar and my other businesses, I'm flying. And I like to fly across the US, Canada, Caribbean. And again, a lot of the analogies on the aviation side are analogies that you can leverage on the solar side, right? Planning is everything. Checklists are everything. Making sure quality assurance is included in everything that you do. Aviation without it, I mean, you'd have planes crashing all over the place, right? So it's these kind of things and analogies that I bring into the solar coaster that I've learned on the aviation side. Bad things happen pretty quickly when you don't plan for these kind of things. And that's really where things are right now. But to answer your question, in a long-winded way, I scuba dive, I fly, but more importantly, I am passionate about helping companies and helping people. So I like and gravitate towards challenges. So when people come back to me and say, I can't do something, right? That's when I come back and say, well, you're not trying hard enough. Let me help, right? Those are just some of the things that I like to do. For me, helping businesses grow, even if I've got nothing, to show for it, is something that I feel every one of us should do that have been in an industry. So I do a lot of that. So if you've got listeners that need help, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help, put you in touch with people. And, there's a lot of opportunity out there that I'm happy to actually introduce people to.
All right, that's perfect, and that's a great way to wrap up. People can get in touch with you via LinkedIn, and you've got that altruism kind of baked in, and you got electrons run through your brain. You're going to be here just kind of like I'm here, really enthusiastic about seeing everybody succeed in this industry. All right, well, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks, Dan, for joining me, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And if you missed any of today's show, you can always go to our website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's Energy Show.